handläggare. Ja, ni får presentera er själva lite närmare. Du kanske kan ta en därifrån och langa. Du tar en där, Susanna. Eller ni har? Nej,
no. Okay.
Så, gör så.
My problem is...
hakan.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone, and welcome to you, my panel. In more than 70 countries in the world, being a homo, bisexual or transgender person means you're actually violating a law with your gender identity or with your sexual orientation. But even in countries where homosexuality is not illegal, many activists and organizations talk about increasing persecution, and the situation is now considered to be worse than in 20 years. What are the reasons behind these harsher attitudes, and how can we best support the LGBTQ community? This is something that we will discuss here today with a very interesting panel. Olena Shevchenko, human rights activist and head of Ukraine organization Inside, fighting for the rights of women and lesbian people. Marcin de Kaminski, program director at Civil Rights Defenders. You're working with human rights defenders at risk. And Maria Bister, development analyst at Sida's Department for Europe. I would like to start by asking you, Maria, if we talk about more crackdowns on homosexuals, can you try to give us an image here? What exactly is it that we see, and what does the situation look like?
Thank you. I would like to start with saying that this is not only a situation that the LGBTIQ community is facing, but as many of you know, there is a trend of a shrinking space for civil society at large in the world globally, even so in Sweden maybe. And what we see and what we also hear from our partners that we work with around the world, and in my case specifically in Eastern Europe, is that when there is a crackdown on civil society, when the space is shrinking for civil society organizations and activists, the groups that from the beginning are already facing the sort of hardest situation and most discrimination, and maybe already have the smallest space in civil society, they are the ones that are hardest, they are suffering hardest when the civic space is shrinking for everyone. So, and that is what we hear, both from partners in the region where I work mostly, but from partners globally. Sorry?
Yes, but could we give some more image? What is it when we talk about more crackdowns and harder conditions and more threats? What is it that the organizations that you support actually talk about?
It's usually a combination, I would say. It's a combination of the legislative environment becoming more difficult to work in. We have several examples of countries where you have the so-called propaganda legislations coming into action, which means that you are actually forbidden to organize around LGBTIQ issues. But you can also see that in many countries you have a very conservative environment that is developing, and that is of course creating problems not only when you organize around LGBTIQ issues, but also when you live as an LGBTIQ person. And if you have a problem living in your private sphere and private life, of course the step to organizing becomes much longer and more difficult to take if you have to fight in your everyday life all the time. And we have a lot of examples of both organizations that we work with that are being closed, and persons that have to leave their country where they live, for example, because it's impossible to stay there and be an open LGBTIQ person. I think many in the audience knows about Chechnya and the recent situations, for example.
Marcin, what do you see in your work working with human rights defenders at risk?
So we at Civil Rights Defenders, we work globally, so we see the same issues that we are discussing here today in many countries. For instance, I just recently came back from Uganda, where the laws and also the attitude against LGBTQ communities and people are very conservative, as you mentioned, Maria.
Kill the gay bill.
Yes, exactly. And each day, basically, major newspapers in Uganda have front pages with gay of the day. kind of stating that these are the people that you should target in your communities. So it's not only a legal issue, it's also a social issue to deal with these attitudes and this aggression against communities, but also people.
But what is your analysis and talking to people in organizations who worked long in this country? Why is this attitude becoming worse? Talking about conservative attitudes, what is it that they see is changing? What is influencing?
I don't think that these attitudes are anything new. Now, currently, we know about them because we are discussing them, we are seeing them, and what we also see, which may mean that we interpret them as spreading, is that actually countries and people learn from each other in another way than previously. So, for instance, the legislation that you talked about, Maria, but also the practices that I assume that you will talk about, Olena, are really something that's well known in many different countries, and I think that goes back to also the kind of political backlash that we see in many countries when nationalism, conservatism, values, traditional values are so super important for many people and many countries to build upon. And that targets the people that are most needing human rights specifically in those countries.
So the legislation, is that more like more anti-propaganda law when it's actually illegal to talk about homosexuality in a positive way? Is that what we see in terms of legal things connected to these values?
Could be, but also I think that the issues and the troubles with registering as an LGBTQ organization is very important, because if organizations would be able to register legally, that would also mean that they will have legal protection when they need, or at least they could ask for legal protection. And I think that's kind of the tricky part as well.
And also it's hard for them some organizations to receive funding from abroad too. Olena, how would you describe the situation in Ukraine, the attitude, both sort of legally and in society, against LGBTQI people?
Actually, it's really good questions you raised about legislation and how it's connected to the social attitude. So I think that legislation never comes from nowhere. Legislation comes from this social atmosphere and social attitude. And to be honest, we all came from the conservative world, more or less in different countries, but still, in the values, the traditional values you already mentioned are really important thing. And we all need to understand that it's not possible, for instance, to work on gender equality and to support, for instance, anti-migration politics. It's not possible to be anti-Muslims and support LGBT rights. It's not possible in terms of human rights understanding and the issue of human rights, because it's a core. Then everybody should be equal, so everybody should be equal on practice, not on the theory, because the theory is the human rights concept, and we need to work it in practice on both levels, legislation and social attitude. In Ukraine we see situation, then of course we don't have this legislation amendment on anti-propaganda yet. Still, because of the revolution, because of the support of Euro Parliament, of European countries and reforms, but we are really close to Russia in the context. It's really close to Russia on conservative front of ultra-nationalists who are raising their voices now, who are supporting anti-migrants, anti-gender politics, and also anti-LGBT. So this is the front, the conservative front on the whole Europe, which are trying to give forces to all those small and big groups who are trying to, go on this traditional backlash and conservative backlash. In Ukraine, we see the huge amount of violence. During recent 6 months, we calculated 52 cases of violence from ultranationalists, which is not investigated by the police.
Why?
Because it's the political atmosphere as well. We are ready for the elections next year, and this traditional thing, like, for instance, to say faith, language, and army, or national idea, that's something everybody heard, but nobody really understands what it's all about, but it's really popular. It's about populism, nothing else.
How would you describe the level of threats against LGBTQI people and their families? What is it that you see and try to help with in your work?
I think that the numbers and the examples that you raised, Olena, that they are really kind of talking to us as people as well, explaining what this is really about. Obviously, this is about, we talked about legislation, but the threats from non-state actors, as we call them, extreme groups, could be right-wing groups or religious extreme groups, they're really raising currently in all the countries that we work in. And that's even more problematic, because when you have a government, a state that you actually could question or meet in a discussion or a dialogue and have claim your rights and make them fulfill their duties, you can't do that with non-state actors, because it's basically hooligans running around and bashing gays. And I think that's kind of a very tricky part, meaning that we also need to rely on each other, on our networks, or our communities, and not only waiting for someone else to fix it.
But this, where you talk about the non-state actors, and we see this unfortunately in Sweden too. Maybe sometimes we're a bit naive when we just talk about these problems in other countries. But is there a difference in, and I assume there is, but the willingness of the state to try to protect or persecute these non-state actors and their unwillingness to do it?
I would say that we can agree that we have an issue in Sweden as well. We could agree that the Swedish government is trying better than other governments to handle this. But we also should agree upon that this problem is not solved in Sweden as well. I mean, we have really radical extreme groups in Sweden, hate-mongering and also discussing rights in a negative way. And we have not found a way to deal with that as a country, as a nation. And that really kind of exemplifies the issues that we have here in Sweden as well, that are very similar in the roots as in other countries, sadly.
Yeah, we will know about Almedalen this year with NMR demonstrating and being there with a presence, threatening people, and the youth organization of RFSL actually felt the need to leave the island. Do you think we have strong democratic institutions in the country? Are they strong enough to handle these problems, or?
I think there's a correlation between democratic structures and rights being fulfilled, but that's not enough. And I think that is why we need to continue talking with, not only with politicians, but with civil society and organizations that are actually communities of people that need it the most.
What do you say, Olena, about the role of institutions?
I would say that it's also, we can't rely on NGOs or civil society organizations, but we need to understand the context as well. So, for instance, you can have like 10, 20 or 100 NGOs, but the instruments they have are, too low or don't have such, huge coverage of the total society. So it should be a cooperation of the state actors and NGOs, and we need to work on tolerance, because this is about this society attitude, which will transform then in some years into legislation, because we all, and state actors and also politicians and also other people come from this society, from this attitude, from this education. So this is about schools, this is about the programs we develop for the schools, this is about our approaches, and we need to teach people human rights from the beginning, because afterwards it will be too late.
Maria, Sida, Sweden through Sida supports organizations like Insight through RFSL. How do you describe Sweden's role and commitments when it comes to supporting these groups and people?
I think that Sweden has a huge responsibility when it comes to supporting not only LGBTQI organizations, but human rights in general, both because we have a very well-developed international development cooperation, but also because we have a lot of international conventions, we have a lot of international regulations that we can actually use when we do work with international actors. For example, when it comes to Eastern Europe, where we do work with RFSL, and through RFSL we also work with Insight, we have countries who have actually said that, yes, we want to become members of the European Union. And in order to become members of the European Union, there is a package. And in that package, there is not only reforms in the financial sectors and in different kind of legislations, but there is also values that comes in this package. especially connected to the visa liberalization process, for example. If you want to have a visa liberalization with Europe, you have to go through a sort of reform regarding your values in the legislative way, first of all, but also in practice. So I think it's a huge responsibility for us.
You mentioned legislation today, like Ukraine passed laws to protect workers' right to be discriminated based on gender at work, and that was like, felt like lip service. We do this to please the European Union. So is that really a powerful tool?
That was a minimum which EU required, so from Ukraine. So and it was a huge case because we saw how 6 times the parliamentarians trying to push on the bottom. They just don't want to vote for this word, sexual orientation and gender identity. They did it only after, calls from EU. That's the reality, and we need to face it, and we need to work with it, because without, the huge discussion in Ukrainian society and other societies as well, it will be no changes.
And you also describe, like, there's a discussion like, we don't want these gender-based ideologies. We don't want to talk about gender-based violence, but men's violence against women. So how strong would you say that values and conservative values?
This is really strong because people think that they will lose their, resources or privileges if somebody will receive the same possibilities. That's the core thing, I guess, in our situation now in Ukraine. We need to somehow explain people that if somebody will receive the same level of rights, it doesn't mean that somebody will took these rights from you. This is the core thing, and this is hard because people who are, especially those who are years in the parliament, they just don't want to listen. That's why we need new people who will come and will influence on needed changes, because in my opinion, I think that our society is more developed than our parliamentarians.
Marcin, I wanted you, because how do you actually work with helping human rights defenders at risk? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, totally. We work with different modalities, and I think that we're quite equal to other organizations doing the same.
Okay.
We, for instance, and I think that Maria mentioned this as well, that a lot of human rights defenders, and we have seen a radical increase in LGBTQ people and human rights defenders as well, that cannot stay where they are. I mean, it's not safe for them to stay in the place that they're living, so we actually need to help them to relocate to a safer place, and my organization, my team is doing that. We also have an alarm system that you, Olena, is part of, where we have 24/7 call, basically rapid response for human rights defenders that are severely at risk.
Calls that goes out sort of to make it public if something happens?
Exactly, so no human rights defenders that is specifically at risk or targeted for a specific reason should feel alone in the struggle. We need to make sure that the communities are strong and that we keep and stay together.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. I would like to ask you a very short answer to the last question. Are we doing enough to support these people at risk? Is it lack of funding, or what would you say is the most important thing to do?
As I mentioned yesterday, it's solidarity on different levels. It's just, to speak to other people, to communicate, to support, and to believe as well.
Would you like to add something, Maria, Marcin?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And hopefully we will be able to continue to do that, at least at the level that we are doing it today, if not more.
No, sadly, the needs are bigger than the resources in terms both in money, funding, but also in solidarity. And I think that we also need to increase all our ambitions to show that we are one.
Thank you very much, Marcin, Olena, and Maria. And please take the chance to come over to Sida's booth over here and talk more to these three interesting panelists before they go back. Thank you.